draw out what I think is a consequence of the view of world and self and ethics presented in the Tractatus for ethics. So you could say that it's, for me, I think about it in two different contexts. One context is the interpretation of the Tractatus, where I have issues with people who has a very voluntaristic understanding of how ethics is. That ethics is purely a matter of my will. I don't think that's completely right. So that's one thing I'm trying to question. And then I have also another way in which this relates to a philosophical argument in more general terms is that I think it has consequences for the debate on realism and anti-realism in ethics. I think simply that what Wittgenstein does in the Tractatus is trying to show that the realism, anti-realism distinction, I mean, much of what we call about in meta-ethics is whether ethics is a domain of realism or a domain of anti-realism, and I think what he's trying to do is to say that that distinction is not enlightening with regard to ethics. So that's another way, and this I will try to draw out. I think these are the two main contexts in which I see it. I'll read the paper. There's a handout. I won't know, most of the quotes should be in the handout. Some of the quotes I won't mention because I had to shorten the thing. So it's, but I hope you can keep track of it. So the main aim of the paper is to, one last thing. I'm referring here to a book by McCarthy called The Road. I'll use that as an example. It's also a movie called The Road, so maybe some of you who haven't read the book have seen the movie. It's a terribly dystopic movie and book, it's a really good book and a nice movie, but it's on a terrible world, dystopic world. So I hope some of you at least do know this, either the book or the movie. So the main aim of the paper is to unfold the interdependence between the notions of world and self, as well as their relation to ethics in the early work of Ludwig Wittgenstein. In order to get this relation into focus, I think I would like to consider an example of someone who is developing self and simultaneously coming to have a world. And I'd like to explore how this development brings with it the challenge to develop an ethical approach to this world. In Cormac McCarthy's 2006 novel, The World, we follow two characters, a father and a son, who is walking across a post-apocalyptic version of North America. We are at some point in the future, after some undescribed catastrophe has brought total devastation to the world, leaving the few survivors without institutions, without safety, and without food. So, the novel is very much a novel of a world, in a sense. Tracing out landscapes covered in ashes, with scorched black trees, decaying cities, car wrecks, and deserted gas stations. Equally prominent in this world is the presence of the other person, or rather the other persons, but mostly in a negative sense, as the presence of other human beings mainly takes the form of a looming possibility of confrontation and violence that shapes the thoughts and fears, actions and choices of the father and the son. In The Road, no one can be trusted, and every outsider is a potential enemy. The novel is, however, also a story of a world of community, the community of the father and the son, their mutual love and attention and anxiety for each other. So, as is described in the beginning of the novel, the father and the son are indeed each other's world entire. Into the novel, the boy, who I think is something like 9 or 10 at the start of the novel, is fully embedded in the one of the two, the father and the son. He's starving and fearful of the world, but he rests in his father's assurances that they will indeed be able to survive and that they have a meaningful purpose in life in their quest to find a warmer place, and that they are indeed, and this is a quote, the good guys, the guys who are carrying the fire. However, as the novel develops, the boy gets older, and he slowly grows into an independent self. And this development pulls him out of his embedded state of childhood and forces him to face the world on his own terms, to make up his mind about how he will approach it. For the boy, this raises a number of questions. For example, of whether the two of them can be right in stealing food from others, of whether they ought to help other people, and of how to understand and justify their surviving amidst the suffering and death of so many other people. In a crucial scene, the man and the boy find an old house in the basement of which is a large number of people are held captive. The two want to free the prisoners, but before they find a way to do so, the gang of people, or that is, the gang of cannibals living in the house, return, and the man and the boy has to flee. The incident leaves the boy in a state of uproar, firstly because of the father's insistence that they cannot, that it's impossible for them to go back to rescue the prisoners of the house, and secondly because of his dawning understanding of why the people in the basement were held captives, of what people, or human beings, can do to each other, of what we can become, in a sense. So, after this incident, the boy falls into a very long period of silence. But then finally, when the father insists that he should share his thoughts, the boy bursts out, and this is the quote. "We would never eat anybody, would we?" And the father concurs, but the boy still presses on and insists, "But we wouldn't." The father says, "No, we wouldn't. No matter what." No, no matter what. What the boy seems to be realizing is that a world is not just something that he is in, pushed and drifting from one place to another, doing whatever the circumstances brings him to do. Rather, having a world means having to be in a world, having to act in one way or the other, and this presupposes, in a way, having a certain perspective on the world, having a view of what the boy will accept as possible, as good or bad in terms of action and choice. What he comes to realize is that such a perspective is essentially his own, and that developing such a perspective means that he is forced to consider what he wants to be, and what he wants to, and how he wants to approach the world. So in this way, you could say that he comes to see that the way he approached the world is also constitutive of who he is as a person. After the encounter with the prisoners, the boy starts to question, and he sometimes opposes the decision of the father. This is also a novel about a teenager. I have one at home. So he starts to question what the father thinks is right. And the result is that on several occasions the boy decides that the two should help strangers, even though the father don't think they should. His only purpose in life is to try to make the boy survive. I think this is what he wants out of life. So he thinks they shouldn't help anyone, they should just do whatever is best for the boy. But the boy opposes this view and decides that the two should help strangers. And the father is very reluctant to do this, both because it exposes them to the threat that other people represent, and because they are always themselves living on the edge of annihilation. They are always short of food. On one such occasion, the boy makes a resolve to give some of their food to a man, resulting in the following conversation between the man and the father. So, this is a longer quote. The old man fitted the tins into his knapsack and fastened the traps. "You should thank him, you know," the man said. "I wouldn't have given you anything. Maybe I should, and maybe I shouldn't." "Why wouldn't you?" "I wouldn't have given him mine." "You don't care if you hurt his feelings." "Will it hurt his feelings?" "No, that's not why he did it." And they're talking about the boy. It's not why the boy helped. "Why did he do it?" He looked over at the boy and he looked at the old man. "You wouldn't understand," he said. "I'm not sure I do." "Maybe he believes in God." "I don't know what he believes in." "He'll get over it." "No, he won't." The two agree that offering help is not a reasonable thing to do. It's not a rational decision. And so they fully agree on the folly of the boy. They do, however, also wonder the source of the resolve to offer help that the boy exhibits. This resolve is not motivated by rational judgment, and is not an outcome of an emotional reaction. They agree on that too. It's not that the boy wants to feel good about himself. And it does not spring from some belief in God. And really, it doesn't seem to be a passing folly. It's not something that the boy will get over. If we should venture a conjecture of its source, It seems as if the boy has found his own way of approaching the world and helping wherever he possibly can. We could call this his ethical stance or his ethical perspective. And such ways of approaching the world is the very source of ethics in the early thinking of Wittgenstein, or this is what I will try to show. In the following, I would like to trace how Wittgenstein in the Tractatus sees an intimate connection between the conception of the world and the conception of self, and insists that ethics arise from this relationship. The main thesis to be investigated is that the notion of world and self are interdependent, that this interdependence is ethical, and this means that ethical questions can be settled neither with reference to the world alone nor to the self alone. I will then argue that this undermines the metaethical distinction between realism and anti-realism that we normally use to analyze and categorize accounts of ethics. And finally, I will shortly look at the striking absence of the other person in Wittgenstein's early ethics. I think this is often we don't discuss this much, but it's interesting how in the ending of the Tractatus, the other person seems to be not present. So, in the ethical remarks. So, section 2. The notion of the world is introduced in the very opening of the Tractatus, where we read, "The world is all that is the case." By choosing this opening, Wittgenstein simply bypasses the traditional metaphysical question of why is there something rather than nothing, in favor of the simple assertion that there is indeed something. The world is. And the world is all that there is. So how are we to understand this sentence? We could see it as a quasi-empirical metaphysical claim about what there is. However, I don't think this is an adequate description of the presented sentence, because really Wittgenstein hasn't told us anything. Rather, what he's pointing out is that the notion of a world already involves the idea of all that there is. If he were making a substantial claim, he would have to claim something like the world really is not all there is, or there really is no world, something like this. So, I'm claiming that the opening sentence of the Tractatus is not presenting a metaphysical claim at all, not a claim that can be supported or undermined. It's rather a sentence that makes explicit how we understand the very notion of a world. And in this way, the sentence is not really about anything in a substantial sense. Rather, I would say that the sentence works as a reminder, one of the elucidations of the Tractatus aimed at, and I quote, the logical clarification of thought. I think we find a similar understanding of the status of the sentences in the Tractatus in André Locke's work on the Tractatus, where Locke remarks on the opening paragraph this way, and I simply want to follow his interpretation here. So I quote, "The world is everything that is the case, for instance, cannot be true, since the world covers exactly the same ground as everything that is the case. And it is probably understood as presenting and showing instead of describing and saying." So it's a kind of a form of a tautology. Elucidation is maybe better. So what I would like to do is to consider the sentence, "The world is all that is the case," to be a form of tautology understood as a sentence that shows structural conditions and relations of our language that can be appreciated simply by reflecting on the way we use words. So this will be the interpretive approach of the present investigation, and I'd like to return to the question of the presentation of the world in the Tractatus. In the opening remarks, we are soon shown that the world has other characteristics besides being that which encompasses everything. If we take the first remark in isolation, the world seems to dissolve, falling to pieces, not in singular objects, but in a motley collection of singular facts. I mean, we only have that, the world is all that is the case, we only have these facts. However, this is not what we understand with the world, a disordered heap of facts. A world is organized. To be a world is to have a certain form that ensures the world's internal unity and the relation between the facts. I think Wittgenstein would say that this is a necessary feature of anything aspiring to be a world. When we are introduced to the world of the father and the boy on the road, for example, we are not introduced to one fact, ashes, and then another, a burnt tree, and a third, an abandoned car. Rather, the facts of their world, the ashes, the burnt trees, and the abandoned cars, make up one world. As they all stand in possible relations to each other, they are organized in a way that allows for the man and the boy's orientation within their world. Wittgenstein presents this feature of the world by saying that the world is an organization of facts in logical space. That, and I quote, "the facts in logical space are the world." However, this organization is not itself part of the world. It's not a thing in the world. So logical space is not something in the world. This is one, I think, of the central insights offered by the elucidations of the Tractatus, that forms of organization, the organization of individual facts, the logical organizations of propositions, as well as the organization of the world, logical space, are not themselves facts. For the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, this means that these forms of organization that are necessary for our uses of language cannot be described. They cannot themselves be the object of language. Rather, they show themselves in the uses of language, or in the way facts present themselves to us. That facts in the world are organized in logical space is not, on Wittgenstein's part, meant as a metaphysical claim about the organization of reality. It's meant as a logical observation about the necessary conditions of something being a fact or a world. It's logical in the sense presented much later in the Tractatus as that which can be clarified independently of any actual experience, as that which is, and I quote, "prior to every experience, prior to the question how, not prior to the question what." Logic is simply the organization of the world. The two are interdependent. In this sense, we can, paraphrasing Wittgenstein, say the world and logic are one. So, organization. So, I think this first step, is quite uncontroversial, not completely. We have different, but quite. So now I'm getting to the more controversial bit. So, because what I want to claim is that logical form is not the only necessary condition of something being a world in the Tractatus. I think what Wittgenstein is trying to show is that a world is first a world when it is indeed a world for someone, at least potentially. I think this is what Wittgenstein aims to show in the 5.6 of the Tractatus. This section begins with an elaboration on the insight of logic in the world of one, with Wittgenstein noting that this has the implication for the self that, and I quote, "the limits of my language means the limits of my world." I can say nothing beyond what is in the world, because what there is in the world is what there is to talk about. The unity of logic and world is what is available for any self. What brings the self into this elucidation of the world is that the world is what shows itself for a self. A world is always someone's world. Or, as Wittgenstein notes, and I quote, "the world is my world." A world is not just there. A world is what is there for someone. And the self is in this sense necessary as a perspective from which the world is available and is ordered. In this sense, and now I do quote Wittgenstein, the world and life are one. According to this notion of world itself, we could say of the boy on the road, not that he slowly discovers the world, but rather that the world takes shape at the same time as he slowly becomes a self. The two arise together. This fundamental understanding of the self, what Wittgenstein calls the philosophical self, is, as Wittgenstein notes, and I quote, "not the human being, not the human body, or the human soul with which psychology deals." In other words, what we're talking about is not a substantial self. It's not the self that is part of the world. Such a full understanding of the self, understood as a human being, a body, or soul, would be yet another contingent fact in the world. It would, for instance, be a contingent fact whether this particular self existed or not. As such, the self could not serve as a necessary condition of having a world, because no part of our experience is at the same time a priori. Wittgenstein is instead trying to elucidate, I think, the simple insight that a world always presupposes a self that is experiencing the world. In the same way that I think this is the idea with the visual field. So the self is necessary for understanding the world in the same way as the presence of an I is necessary for us to understand the idea of a visual field. And as the I is not itself one of the facts that occurs within the visual field, the self that conditions the world is not itself a fact occurring in this world. It rather shows itself as, and I quote again from 5632, a limit of the world. The self is not in any way to be understood as a fact, but becomes evident when we reflect on how the world always reveals itself from a particular perspective, and not, for example, from, in a sense, a view from nowhere. And this perspective is not itself part of the world, rather it is a perspective on whatever happens in the world. And it thus in this way works as an organizing principle of this whatever. In the same way as the location of the I works as the organizing principle for the visual field. So the I is not present in the visual field, but everything that's in the visual field is related to the location of the I. So, as such, the philosophical self cannot be described as said, it simply shows itself as a condition of our notion of the world. So, we can, however, ask what is implied within this perspective of the self. Wittgenstein addresses this question explicitly in the notebooks. Here he asks, and I quote, "Can we conceive of a being that isn't capable of will at all, but only of idea, of seeing, for example?" And he goes on, "In some sense this seems impossible, but if it were possible, then there could be a world without ethics." I think these remarks involve 2 points that are crucial to the present investigation. The first point comes out if we consider Wittgenstein's remark that it is in some sense impossible that the philosophical self, that there could be a being only capable only of idea but not of will. What we have seen is that the philosophical self is the organizing point, starting point of the world, and as such it's not arbitrary, because as a self I'm always looking here rather than there, I'm moving here rather than there. And it's not necessary, because I'm not doing any of this necessarily. I could always look somewhere else, or I could always go somewhere else. That is, the form of organization constituted by the self is not contingent, nor is it a priori. It is actualized as a result of what we can recognize as will. Where I look and where I go is a matter of my will. So will is a necessary part of the philosophical self. The second point is related to this. If the notion of the philosophical self necessarily implies a notion of will, then having a perspective on the world also means having to deal with that world, having to will something in particular. As one's perspective is a result of will, being a self involves responsibility for this perspective, for what one wills. And in this way, the will of the philosophical self is the source of ethics. Or as Wittgenstein sums up these 2 points, and I quote again from the notebooks, "If the will did not exist, neither would there be that center of the world which we call the I, and which is the bearer of ethics. In this way, the willing subject is a condition of the world, where the will is understood as, and I quote again, an attitude of the subject to the world." So, what I've tried to present is a picture according to which ethics arise because the self, having a world, necessarily implies that the self has to deal with the world, has to look somewhere rather than other, has to go somewhere rather than other. And this in turn implies having to take some features of the world to be more salient, more important, more valuable in a sense than other features. The question is what establishes such salience and value. According to Will, it's the result of an organizing work of the will. He goes on to note with a phrase for it from Joseph Butler, and I quote, "Things acquire significance only through their relation to my will, for everything is what it is and not another thing." The perspective of or relation to the world, established by the will of the self, is thus also at the same time the establishment of salience or value, for which the self is ethically responsible. However, as the world is precisely what is given for the self, what the self makes an object of its will is at the same time made the object of its life and its world. In this sense, Wittgenstein insists the world and life are one. So, what I would like to argue is also that the unity of the world and life shouldn't be understood in the sense that the self has the power to determine what the world is like. What it's responsible for is for establishing the focus of how the world is approached, and this focus establishes how the self and the world coincide. However, what makes up this unity of world life or world self is a given reality with which the philosophical self is confronted and which it cannot alter. And this means that part of what is demanded in ethics is to accept the world life as it is, not as the self wish it would be. As Wittgenstein remarks in the notebooks, the will of the philosophical self, or the ethical will, and I quote, enters into the world completely from the outside as into something that is already there, and unquote. And whatever ethical perspective the self takes on the world, it cannot change the fact of which the world consists. The world is what it is. So, and I quote again, if the good or bad exercise of the will does alter the world, it can alter only the limits of the world, not the facts, not what can be expressed by means of language, as Wittgenstein sums up in the Tractatus. Ethics is not established by any facts regarding the actual self or the actual world. It rather concerns how the self relates to the given facts of the world in which it finds itself. So it's a relation between self and world, not something coming from either side. So, where am I? So, and this is, I think, why Wittgenstein insists that there are no ethical sentences. Ethics is not part of what we can describe, but it conditions how we approach what we can describe. In Tractatus, we find this point generalized, not just with regard to ethical judgment, but anything that concerns value. And I quote, in the world, everything is what it is, and everything happens as it does happen. In it, no value exists, and if it did, it would have no value. Ethics is not in the past, in the facts, past, present, and future. Rather, ethics is how we relate to these facts. In this sense, ethics cannot be accounted for in factual terms, it cannot be put into words, but it is indeed transcendental. So, what I've been arguing is that Wittgenstein is trying to draw out an idea of ethics that arises out of the mutual constitutive relation between self and world. And this allows us to present a Wittgenstein-inspired understanding of the resolve of the boy in the world, what would center of the discussion between the man and the father. What we see in his resolve to help others, or never to eat anybody, is an ethical move, as it determines his will by setting up a condition under which he will from now on live and act and approach the world, independently of what he will actually encounter there. In this way, the resolve changes the way he relates to the world, no matter what, as he insists. In a very straightforward sense, it does, however, not alter anything in the world. It's not. It doesn't alter what will happen to the boy or give him more power over the consequences of his actions or anything. So no matter how carefully we go on to describe his world, we do not encounter his ethical resolve here. And moreover, if you try in this description to include himself, for example, a psychological description of his resolve as arising as a consequence of his character or his psychological resources, it may perhaps enable us to explain how he came to have this resolve, but we wouldn't get a hold of what makes it ethical. And so even that description himself would not, or his inner life would not give us the motivation for this resolve. So it cannot be accounted for, in fact, either the external world or his mental state. Yet in another sense, the resolve alters the whole world of the boy, because it alters the conditions under which he lives, and with it the possibilities of choices and actions available to him. In this sense, his resolve changes the limits of his world, and because of this, I think we can call it ethical in a Tractarian understanding of ethics. I've spoken for half an hour already. Is this true?
No, 5 minutes. We have 5 minutes.
5 minutes left. Okay. So I will talk a bit about how I think this challenges realism, anti-realism, and we don't get to the other. So I think that in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein is trying to make visible a conception of the world that is necessarily viewed from the perspective of a willing self, and he thus makes the notions of self and world mutually constitutive. I think it's quite safe to say that this is an unusual conception of ethics. I think whatever Wittgenstein is doing in the end of the Tractatus is not kind of a standard understanding of ethics. I think this becomes particularly clear if we try to approach the Tractarian conception of ethics via what is in contemporary meta-ethics often presented as the most fundamental distinction between ethical positions, the distinction between realists and anti-realists' understanding of ethics. So how to flesh out this distinction, I know is much debated and unclear, but we could maybe see whether ethics is constituted by something that exists in a mind-independent manner, or whether ethics involves the thesis that moral properties exist, involves a denial of the thesis that moral properties exist mind-independent. So the question is whether ethics is mind-independent or mind-dependent. So what we could try to interpret the conception of ethics just developed on the basis of this distinction. And then I think that would proceed more or less like this. First, we would note how Wittgenstein repeatedly insists that ethics do not concern facts. Ethics is not in the world, it cannot be described by language. So this seems to entail that Wittgenstein is not advocating a form of moral realism. That seems clear. Secondly, we could note how Wittgenstein ties ethics to the will of the self, and then we could conclude that we must instead be developing a form of anti-realism, arguing that ethics arises from our volitions or projections. According to this line of interpretation, which I think is quite common, Tractarian ethics is therefore indeed quite mind-dependent. So if we start from the dichotomy between forms of realism and anti-realism in ethics, then it seems that we are forced to assume that ethics in the Tractatus must be anti-realistic in a sense. However, I think this line of interpretation of ethics in the Tractatus as a form of anti-realism conflicts with the way that Wittgenstein consistently and forcefully insists that all facts that concern actual selves or actual human beings or human souls belong to the world and are therefore ethically irrelevant. He says this over and over again. What is shown in the Tractatus is that with regard to ethics, facts about our inner lives or actual feelings or are facts like any other facts, and they are as such not possible sources of ethics. Ethics is neither in the world nor in us. In this way, I think that Wittgenstein simply rejects or discards the idea that the distinction between realism and anti-realism, between mind-independent and mind-dependent facts, is of fundamental relevance for an understanding of ethics. And now to come to a conclusion. So, I think the view of ethics of the Tractatus indicates, that our kind of consistent attempt to try to place ethics somewhere, either out there in the world or in here, in us, is in a sense fundamentally mistaken. And I think he thinks it's fundamentally mistaken in a number of different ways. First of all, it's mistaken because we assume that ethics should be understood with reference to facts, either subjective or objective. I think also he finds it mistaken because it assumes that we can see self and world as radically independent of each other, where he would say that they are rather mutually dependent. And it's mistaken by not seeing that ethics arises from and concerns this very interdependence, the interdependence between self and world. In other words, an attempt to figure out where to place ethics rests on a strong distinction between self and world that I think the early Wittgenstein simply doesn't accept. So what I've been trying to argue is that the elucidation of the Tractatus with regard to ethics poses a fundamental challenge to the very framework set up by the realism and anti-realism distinction for discussing the nature of ethics.
I really like your presentation, but I remain a little bit skeptical about your conclusion whether or not Wittgenstein is a realist and an anti-realist. So your view is that he's rejecting both. I would like to say that I am sympathetic with that. But I think I have a different understanding because in order to reject both, you should find a single assumption that is shareable, let's say, by both, by the realist and the anti-realist. And then to say that Wittgenstein would reject this single assumption. Okay, in my view, we can find this single assumption in the following way. For instance, whether or not the goodwill in the ethical sense it is in the world or not. If you take this in a, let's say, in an empirical way, like a desire to change the world in one way or another, I think that you could reject that ethics is not there in the world, and also it's not in us in the sense that our empirical will is at stake. So I think that you, in my view, you have the right insight, but I remain skeptical whether your solution to say that there is a mutual interdependence between the self and the world is the way to say that Wittgenstein is not a realist, neither a realist nor an anti-realist. Why? Because I think that in this sense he is a realist, because there is a mutual interdependence between the self and the world that matters. So I don't know if you agree with this. It's not really an objection,
No.
let's say, but I remain, let's say, not convinced.
I think we're, you say, well, if he rejects both realism and anti-realism, I should find the single assumption that he is rejecting both. And I think what I take to be the shared assumption between the two is that ethics has to be placed somewhere. So if it's either it's out there or it's in here. So it's in. So and I had somewhere in my notes I have different ways. When people are presenting the realism and anti-realism distinction, they would say, well, it's a matter of whether ethics are connected to mind-independent or mind-dependent facts. So both of them, in some sense, I think this is what Wittgenstein really nicely shows. Both of them are saying it's some kind of fact, it's just different kinds of facts. And
but this is empirical will, not, let's say,
this is the, yeah, exactly. Yes. So he would say, and this is mistaken because this is, what we can get with out there. We get facts; they don't have any value, or we get empirical will. In here, we get empirical will, and that's facts as well, but they don't, in that sense, has any value either. So I think that's the common assumption between forms of realism and anti-realism, at least as they are currently described, is that there's, what they're quarreling about is just what kind of facts should we attach value to. And Wittgenstein is saying we shouldn't, value doesn't come with either one kind of mind-independent facts or mind-dependent facts. And he would say, he would reject both, I think. So I think this far is good. I think we agree completely. And then I have a more positive, so that's the negative kind of work I think is done in the Tractatus. Maybe we don't agree completely, but At least that was what I.
No, it is just that because if it is in us, but it's empirical will, there is no difference between facts.
No.
So it's not a real dichotomy, I'd say.
Yeah, he would say it's not a real economy. It's not. I mean, it's what is inflated to a big difference in the realism and anti-realism, whether it's one kind of fact or the other kind of fact is in this, from this perspective, from the ethical perspective, it's not a real difference at all. They're all irrelevant, all of the facts. So I think this is where we agree. And then I come with this more positive, and I think much harder. I think it's much harder to flesh out what is it then that Wittgenstein is. I mean, so the negative, we feel really confident about this. I think this is what he's saying, and this is where we agree. So I think the much harder work is to try to. But what is he saying then? I mean, he's not, because I think some interpretations tend to fall back still and say, but ethics is voluntaristic or ethics is a matter of will, and they have to rely on some notion of empirical will, and I don't think they can. So I get this, what I'm trying to, and this seems to, and another thing is that I feel really confident about is that there seems to be a conceptual, for Wittgenstein, conceptual link between self and world. This is what he's doing in the 5.6 section of the Tractatus. So a world is something that is experienced by a self. Those two come together. So, and ethics ties to that. Ethics arises from that. So I would say that for him, this is the more controversial, and I think harder. It's just hard also to get your head around. But simply, I am the organizing principle of my world, and this for whatever I approach in the world. And this is not what I actually do, but it's simply that I approach something rather than other. That this is what ethics is, and to get hold of that. So it's the mutual constitution of self and world for which I'm responsible, and that's a point with it's not a fact. It has no extension, so I've been trying to flesh out what could that mean, and I think that I'm trying to, with the literary example, is trying to say that deciding, for example, that could be one example. I won't consider this. Should I eat other people? I won't. But I won't. That's not. That's not a decision about facts, and it's not even a question of empirical will, because nothing. It's more settling. These are the conditions under which I will approach the world. I will not look at other people and think they might be food. So I think, and so I'm trying to draw out how, and I think in a way, what I would relate it to, and I've done this in other work, is something like the certainties of the later philosophy. Things that we take for granted in a way that it doesn't even appear within our considerations. I think there is a relation to this kind of, that's how it develops into the
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, first of all, for your very interesting talk. My question goes in the same direction of the previous one. So I'm also quite sympathetic towards your view, these what I would call these intermediate views, and I agree with you, non-anti-realism. But I'm also skeptical about where would you find this third stance, so to speak, because the example you gave us from McCarthy seems to suggest perhaps more a realist view, and so my point is that if you say that Wittgenstein was neither realist nor anti-realist, perhaps this will lead to his rabbit figure, so we can see from one angle or see from another perspective. But actually, what I seem that the passages you quote from McCarthy suggest is this realist view. So I would like to ask you if you can really give us a third stance that is absolutely independent from these two that I think we all agree you are criticizing well.
Well, I mean, I like the dialogue between the father because they kind of, it's not, thank God McCarthy is writing a book and not philosophical, but they're still kind of trying out different perspective. And what the father keeps insisting with the boy trying to help other people is that it's not, he actually says it's not realistic. So that, we'll die doing this. We cannot be, if we ourselves can, are dying of hunger, we cannot give our food to other people. And so he tries out the God perspective. We don't think that's, and he tries the emotional perspective is because the boy feels bad about this, and he says, well, it's not bad. So it has this nice exploration of, different sources. It's in the facts, it's in his emotions, I have a section on the supernatural in the full of paper, which I also think is the bad way to go, but it's a way we go where we can't place it anywhere else we go supernatural. I don't think Wittgenstein would do that. I think he doesn't say ethics is transcendent, he says ethics is transcendental. I think that's important. So, and I think the way we discuss ethics is so shaped by this need to place ethics somewhere. So I think, and what I find nice about it is about the novel is that, of course, the world goes into it. Some things are. I have this. I presented this with people who. It's actually have Levinas in it also in the paragraph. And Levinas would have a very nice way of solving this problem. So he would say, well, it's not realistic, it's not anti-realistic, but it's the infinity of the other. Confronted with that, what's valuable, what's not, just that cuts through. And that's nice also because it gives you the normativity. You know what the normativity of ethics is about. It's about taking care of the other person. And Wittgenstein doesn't do that. So and I think that's a really hard and intriguing idea of the early ethics. You don't get this kind of measurement rod of what is ethical normativity. And what I'm trying to suggest here, I'm not sure it's the right way to go, is that it, in a sense, I would think it's the intersection between the philosophical world and the world. And so of course, realism comes into it. What we see as valuable, in a sense, I would say that on Wittgenstein's view, we could see anything as valuable, but we are then responsible for it. So if I decide that I'll value the color blue and nothing else, you could really approach me and say, it's just crazy. That doesn't come out as significant or valuable in any way in accordance to the way, how would you live your life trying to do that? But it's that intersection between what I take to condition my life and the life I mean. That's the problem is that's not a point. That's just that's like the eye is not a point in the visual field. Ethics here becomes just simply that intersection. So, I'm not sure it's the right way to understand ethics. I am beginning to be quite confident it's the right way to understand what Wittgenstein is trying to do in the Tractatus. But it's really hard to conceptualize, and especially I think in the book, because of the way that we normally conceptualize ethics currently. So I don't know if this is.
What I find nice in your approach is that you underline this the link between subject and world, right?
Yeah.
And subject as something as a starting point of organization.
Yeah.
And I wonder if objection could not be, for example, that in order to have an organized world, it is enough logic. We don't need perhaps a subject, organize a subject. If we are convinced that the world organizes it by the laws of logic, by the constants of logic, don't you know, it can be a challenge to your view, or to this view, to this underlying it. I think it's what makes it interesting. Your approach is challenge.
I've been thinking. this comes out of a long kind of infatuation, but also puzzlement with the 5.6 of the Tractatus. Suddenly the self jumps in there. How do we get to that? But if we take the beginning, we say, okay, there's the world has to be organized, so it's a logical space. But then I think where the self becomes a necessary feature of something being a world is that logical, facts in logical space are not in any way. Organization also has to have a starting point. It's just so for something to be a world, to be something to be understood as a unity, it has to be seen from somewhere. I would say, I think that's what Wittgenstein would want to say, and I think in a sense that's right about, facts in logical space is not a world, that's a possibility or something. It's not really, it doesn't have the unity in which to have a unity, there's a perspective from which everything is seen.